You may well have seen the 1980 Oscar-nominated film Breaker Morant. Set in South Africa during the Anglo Boer War, it tells the actions of an Australian soldier, Harry Breaker Morant, his trial and execution for shooting Boer prisoners. The film and the books that inspired it opened a passionate debate in Australia about whether he and other colonial troops were scapegoats for the British Empire, or whether they were war criminals rightly brought to justice. It also poses the question, is following orders, especially verbal orders, a defence? It's a debate that is as alive in Australia and elsewhere in the world today as it was over 100 years ago. So, was he a war criminal or a scapegoat? And how comes the man who started the killing of the Boer prisoners walked free? This is the truth behind the film Breaker Morant. Harry Breaker Morant was a colourful character long before he ever reached South Africa. Born in England in 1864, he arrived in Australia when he was 19, and for the next 2 decades he was a drover, horsebreaker, hence the nickname, womaniser, storyteller and bush poet. He left a string of broken hearts and unpaid debts as he moved around the country. Jailed on several occasions for theft as well as those unpaid debts, he was a friend of the poet Banjo Paterson and actually married the future Daisy Bates. But it lasted a matter of months before he was on the move again, with debtors in hot pursuit. A natural raconteur, he enthralled audiences in bars and around campfires with his wit, his poetry and his family background, claiming to be the illegitimate son of Admiral Sir George Digby Morant back in England. The reality was somewhat different. He was born Edwin Henry Morant in Somerset, where his father was the master of the Bridgewater workhouse. But let's face it, love child of an admiral sounds far better than the son of the workhouse master, doesn't it? So upon arriving in Australia in 1883, Edwin changed his name to Harry Harwood Morant. Using this alias and backstory, he even charmed his way into a party with the Governor of South Australia, Lord Tennyson, son of the Charge of the Light Brigade poet. For the record, the old Admiral swore blind that the Breaker certainly was not his love child, but hey, why spoil a good story? The outbreak of the Anglo Boer War in South Africa in October 1899 was greeted with huge enthusiasm in Australia. Whilst it's remembered as the British themselves taking on the 2 Boer republics, some 23,000 Australians, 6,000 New Zealanders, 8,000 Canadians and over 1,000 Rhodesians also fought on the side of the British Empire. With a thirst for adventure, and probably with a wary eye on those debt collectors, Harry Morant swiftly enlisted in the 2nd South Australia Mounted Rifles. Arriving in South Africa in February 1900, he spent the next 9 months serving as a dispatch rider, an obvious position with someone with his equine knowledge and skills, and saw action in several battles, including Diamond Hill, where Winston Churchill was also in action, and I've told that story and how Churchill was supposedly recommended for a Victoria Cross in a recent episode. He also rose to the rank of sergeant. When his term of service ended, he left with positive reports from his superiors and even the offer of a commission should he stay on. But a new adventure was calling. Despite being adopted by future generations as an Australian, Harry saw himself first and foremost as an Englishman. It was now time to return to the home country and seek for himself the position in society which he'd always dreamed of. It was also, of course, an opportunity to clear his debts. However, the brash, illegitimate son of an admiral character that had worked so well in Australia didn't cut much ice back in England. His attempt to climb the social ladder came to nothing. There was one positive outcome to his visit to England, or at least it seemed so at the time. He became firm friends with Captain Percy Hunt. Indeed, there were unconfirmed reports that Morant became engaged to Hunt's sister. 9 years younger than the 36-year-old Morant, Percy Hunt had been born in France and had been commissioned in the regular British Army in 1896. He now persuaded Morant to travel with him back to South Africa in search of more action and adventure. Arriving in Cape Town, Morant had intended to join the newly formed British officered Transvaal Constabulary, but Hunt convinced him to join a much more exciting unit, the Bushveldt Carbineers. It would be a death sentence for both of them. The Bushveldt Carbineers were an irregular mounted infantry unit of the British Army that had been established in early 1901 to counter the continuing Boer guerrilla resistance in the Transvaal. Operating effectively independently of normal regiments, their role was to move light and fast, playing the Boers at their own game. Like many anti-insurgency operations, it descended into a dirty little war, where lines were blurred between the rulebook and operational requirements out in the field. No more so than in the Zoutpansberg mountain region in northern Transvaal. Here, despite the British capturing the capital of Transvaal, Pretoria, the previous year, the Boers continued to fight on. In June 1901, a Carbineer outpost was established at Fort Edward, about 90 miles north of the local British HQ at Pietersburg, under the command of a British officer, Captain Robertson. Remote from support, but also miles from authority, the Carbineers here rapidly started to earn a reputation for both being effective fighters, but also out of control. Rumours reached British High Command of indiscipline, lawlessness, and even an allegation of sexual assault by Captain Robertson himself. In July, Robertson was removed and replaced by Percy Hunt. He requested that his friend and recently commissioned Lieutenant Harry Morant join him. Because of the Morant link, there is a common misconception that the Carbineers were an Australian unit. They weren't. Whilst about 40% of the 300 plus men were Australians, the rest came from across the British Empire. Yes, definitely British and Irish there, but also New Zealanders, Rhodesians and even South Africans. Men who could ride hard, shoot straight and live off the land. And also just to be clear, it was a British regiment, not an Australian one, and both Hunt and the outgoing Robertson were British officers. On the 6th of August, during a botched night attack on a Boer commando holed up in a farmhouse, Captain Hunt was killed, and the rest of his men retreated back to the fort. The shocked Morant, who hadn't been present, now took over the detachment. When a party returned to the farmhouse, he claimed that the sergeant present, Sergeant Robinson, told him that Hunt's body had been stripped and supposedly mutilated. I say supposedly because the only evidence that we have of this is from Morant at his later trial. With regard to the stripping of the body, this was common practice for Boer commandos who were living off the land and took whatever they needed from the dead: horses, food, arms and clothing. Less than a week later, on the 11th of August, Morant led a surprise attack on a Boer commando, killing some whilst the remainder fled. They also took a prisoner. This Boer, by the name of Visa, was found to be wearing Hunt's khaki uniform. Morant immediately ordered him to be shot in reprisal for his friend's death and supposed mutilation. Nearly 2 weeks later, on the 23rd of August, 8 Boers who had surrendered near the Elim Hospital just to the east of Fort Edward were lined up and once again, on Morant's orders, executed. Now, it just so happened that the event was witnessed by a visiting Lutheran preacher. The Reverend Daniel Hazer had been born in the British Cape Colony, but of German descent, and was working for the Berlin Missionary Society. An Afrikaans speaker, he'd prayed and counselled the men prior to their dramatic execution. The shocked clergyman told Morant that he had committed murder, and he'd report him to his superiors in Pietersburg. He set out in his wagon, flying his usual white flag. That afternoon, he and his African driver were shot dead. A later courts-martial alleged that the shooting was carried out by Lieutenant Peter Handcock from Morant's unit, acting on Morant's orders. It seemed that the lovable charmer, chancer, rogue and bush poet had turned into a war criminal. Or was he? If the elimination of the German civilian was supposed to cover up the shootings of the Boer prisoners, it did nothing of the sort. About 6 weeks later, on the 4th of October, the British commander in Pietersburg, Colonel Hall, received a letter signed by 15 men from Morant's command, blowing the lid on the whole operation in the Zoutpansberg area. In the film, Breaker Morant, along with Lieutenant Handcock and another young officer, George Whitton, are put on trial at courts-martial in January 1902. In reality, actually it was 6 officers who were put on trial. Alongside Morant, Handcock and Whitton were Lieutenant Henry Picton, the Carbineers commander, Major Lenihan, and an intelligence officer attached to Fort Edward, Captain Alfred Taylor. And we're going to hear a lot more about that man, whom the local Africans called Bolala, he who kills, in a little while, because what happened to him is in sharp contrast to what happened to Breaker Morant. In the film, it is one long trial. In reality, it was actually a series of trials dealing with separate charges that were held back to back under the same presiding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Denny. The men were defended by an Australian officer who'd been a solicitor back in Civvy Street, Captain James Francis Thomas. Thomas had participated in the desperate and heroic battle at Eland's River back in August 1900, and another story that I've previously told. Now he was fighting another life or death battle, this time in the courtroom, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Morant and Handcock faced 4 charges of murder involving 13 victims. Whitton, the involvement in the murder of 9 prisoners. Picton, of delivering the coup de grace on Boer captive Visa. Major Lenihan was charged for not having reported another murder that had come to his attention earlier in 1901. And Taylor for the murder of 6 other Boers as well as a black African. Thomas had his work cut out. He'd only agreed to defend the men the night before the first courts-martial was due to start. Whether the men were guilty of murder was never really in doubt. Morant, in his defence, actually stated that he had ordered the execution of the Boers, although not the priest. In the film, he claims they were acting in accordance with Rule 303, in other words, the rule of the bullet. But, and this is where Thomas placed his defence, Morant said that he was following orders. Those orders had been given to him verbally by Captain Hunt, who claimed that he had received them from higher authorities. Yet, Thomas was unable to produce any written evidence that such orders existed. He was relying on hearsay. His request that Colonel Hall, who'd been the British military commander in northern Transvaal, attend and give evidence, was turned down, as Hall, by now, was actually serving way off in India. In the film, Thomas then requests that General Kitchener, the Commander-in-Chief of the whole British Empire Army in South Africa, be summoned to give his evidence as to whether he personally had issued a verbal order to shoot Boer prisoners out of hand. In the film, Colonel Denny refused that request too. The only problem is that there is no record of that request ever being made in the courtroom. In fact, the transcripts of the court-martial have never been produced. And whilst it's easy to smell a cover-up, it's also just as easy to argue that records from a war over 100 years ago in an age of volumes of paperwork may genuinely have been lost or destroyed. What we do know is that Kitchener never appeared as a witness, and no witnesses could corroborate Morant's claim. The lost transcripts are not the only concerning part of this trial. Unlike the film, the accused were held in solitary confinement and reportedly not allowed to seek advice from their defence until the evening before that first trial. They were not properly informed of the charges in advance and not allowed to communicate with each other. The court sat in secret, contrary to the regulations that court-martials be open. And then, in a bizarre twist, while the court-martials were underway, Petersburg was attacked by the Boers on the 22nd of January and the following day. The accused were suddenly released from their cells, given arms to defend the town, and then afterwards locked up again. Morant, Handcock and Whitton were all found guilty of the murders of the Boer prisoners. Picton was also found guilty of shooting the dying Boer in the Hunt's uniform and was cashiered out of the army. Morant and Handcock now faced the next trial for the murder of Reverend Hazer. The prosecution claimed that Morant wanted to prevent the minister from reporting the execution to Colonel Hall in Petersburg and ordered Lieutenant Handcock to intercept and eliminate him. Both men denied the charge, and rather like the verbal argument, it was the prosecution's word against theirs. But then the prosecution produced a witness. A black African, travelling along the same track as the German missionary, saw a mounted British soldier ride past, and then just up ahead he heard some shots. Rounding the corner, he came across the dead minister and his driver. The witness identified Lieutenant Peter Handcock as that mounted soldier. There was only one problem: the colour of that witness. Morant indignantly challenged the court as to whether they would accept a black man's version of events over the word of a British officer. In the film, interestingly, the witness is changed to a white soldier, and there's no reference whatsoever to the black driver that had been killed. Morant and Handcock were acquitted, not because the court actually found them not guilty, but because they had no other evidence apart from the word of a black witness that they weren't willing to accept. Nevertheless, the two men and George Whitton had been found guilty of murdering, in Whitton's case 9, and in Morant and Handcock's cases 12 unarmed Boer prisoners. All three were sentenced to death. Having come to their conclusion, the sentence was passed up the chain of command to Kitchener, with the court's recommendation for mercy on all three. Kitchener ignored that request and confirmed the death sentences on Morant and Handcock. He did, however, commute George Whitton's sentence to life imprisonment. When defence lawyer James Thomas tried to meet Kitchener to plead for clemency and to request an appeal to London, he was told that Kitchener was, conveniently some would say, visiting troops, and London had already agreed with the punishment. All three men were now in jail in Pretoria, when on the 26th of February they were informed of Kitchener's decision. Just 18 hours later, Lieutenant Harry Breaker Morant and Lieutenant Peter Handcock were executed by firing squad. Handcock left a wife and 3 children back in Australia. They were buried in the same grave in a nearby cemetery. It might surprise you to know, based on how well known Breaker Morant is nowadays, that at the time the reaction in Australia was muted. While some of the initial enthusiasm for the war had indeed dampened, that was more due to the conditions being experienced by Boer civilians in the concentration camps, rather than the execution of 2 Australian officers who had shot Boer prisoners in cold blood. In fact, the only outpouring surrounding the case was on behalf of young Whitton. A petition of 80,000 signatures was presented to King Edward VII, resulting in his release in 1904. Even Whitton's own account of the whole incident, Scapegoats to the Empire, published in 1907, swiftly faded from view. It wasn't until Kit Denton's 1973 novel, The Breaker, and above all, Bruce Beresford's Oscar-nominated 1980 film, Breaker Morant, that the debate was reignited. As an interesting footnote, in 1929, George Whitton revealed in a letter to the old defence lawyer, James Thomas, that Handcock had indeed confessed to him of the murder of Reverend Hazer shortly after the acquittal. So, were Morant and Handcock guilty of murder? Well, you'd be hard-pressed to argue no, especially as Morant himself admitted that he had ordered the shootings, except of Reverend Hazer, in court. But was the trial fair? Was he condemned to death for following orders? And was he a scapegoat? For this we return to Captain Alfred Taylor, as I promised we would. He was the 6th officer to face the courts-martial, and the only one who was not a member of the Bushveldt Carbineers. Irish-born Taylor was no stranger to Africa. He'd fought in the Matabele rebellion in Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, where he'd earned a fearsome nickname from his Matabele enemy, Bulala, the one who kills. A fellow British officer at the time called him a sadist. In 1901, he'd been sent to Fort Edward by none other than Lord Kitchener himself as an intelligence officer attached to, but apart from, the Bushveldt Carbineers. Alongside that position, he was also acting native commissioner. So, whilst not part of the Carbineer chain of command, by force of personality, his extra hierarchical link to Kitchener, his control over local Africans, and a fearsome reputation, it was Taylor rather than Robertson who seemed to be in charge in the early days. On the 2nd of July at Valdezia, Taylor received word that 6 Boers were coming into the fort to surrender in 2 wagons with a herd of cattle. Taylor gave the order to shoot them. Robertson agreed and passed it down the line until the unarmed Boers were shot in cold blood by a Sergeant Oldham and several troopers. So, before Hunt and Morant had ever arrived in the area, Boer prisoners were being shot. And they were being shot on the orders of a British, not Australian, officer. Thanks to the letter signed by the 15 members of the Carbineers, Taylor too was brought in front of the courts-martial. But none of the men who had actually executed the Boers had specifically been ordered to do so by Taylor. Just like the whole Morant saga, it was a verbal chain of command, and the only person who could specifically point the finger at Taylor was the former Carbineer commander at Fort Edward, Captain Robertson. And he did just that, testifying to the court. But there was a problem with Robertson. He'd been removed from his position and replaced by Hunt under a bit of a cloud, not least an accusation of sexual assault. The court decided that he was not a credible witness. He was covering for himself. Taylor was acquitted of both the Valdezia massacre and also the killing of a local black African. Having already resigned his commission, he went back to Rhodesia, where he died peacefully in 1941, aged 79. The contrast between his acquittal and Morant and Handcock facing the firing squad was stark and inexplicable. So, were they scapegoats? And if so, for what? At the end of the day, we'll never know if Kitchener issued verbal orders to shoot Boer prisoners, as Morant claimed Hunt had told him. We certainly know that in September 1901 he issued orders confirming that Boers wearing British uniform were to be treated as spies and were liable to execution. But whatever you might think about Kitchener, and there's a lot of thoughts about Kitchener, in this regard he was merely following normal procedure for most nations at war. The same thing happened to German troops dressed in American uniform during the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. And following Kitchener's orders, in January 1902, the same time that Morant and co were on trial, New Zealand troops executed a Boer in British uniform. The difference was, on that occasion, the Boer was found guilty at a court-martial before execution, not shot out of hand. During the period May to September 1901, over 5,000 Boers were taken prisoner and were shipped to camps in such places as St Helena, India and Bermuda. So, a verbal order to shoot all Boer prisoners, carried out by Hunt, Taylor and Morant, certainly wasn't being carried out elsewhere in South Africa. Strange that Kitchener's order had only filtered down to the Zoutpansberg area of the Transvaal, but it's always possible, I guess. In the film, it was argued that Morant, Handcock and Witten were pawns in a bigger game. Firstly, that the German government, enraged by the murder of their missionary, wanted some form of accountability, and the British authorities, keen to keep the Germans out of the war, duly obliged. Secondly, Kitchener was trying to bring the Boers to the negotiating table and wanted to prove to them that he was acting in good faith. What better way than sacrificing a couple of mere colonial officers who'd shot some of the Boer prisoners? Caesar was working for a German missionary society and had German ancestry. He had been born in the British Cape Colony. Moreover, if the British really wanted to placate the Germans, why did they acquit Handcock and Morant of the murder, when they actually had a witness, even if he was black? It was the only charge the men were actually acquitted on. And with regard to the second point, trying to bring the Boers to the negotiating table, that certainly might have been in Kitchener's mind, and explain his absence when Thomas wanted to meet him. But how important was it, rather than, say, improving conditions in the concentration camps? We'll never know. The film plays heavily on the fact that Kitchener deliberately avoided being called as a witness, sending his Chief of Staff, Ian Hamilton, to cover up, using the words, "You know what to say." Despite the lack of court transcripts, there is plenty of other evidence relating to the trials, such as an article in the Times in April 1902, and of course Witten's own first-hand account in Scapegoats of the Empire. No one mentions Ian Hamilton taking the stand. But maybe including the commanding officer at Gallipoli of all places was too good a story for the film producers to miss. The film ends with Peter Handcock and Harry Breaker Morant walking hand in hand to their execution. As the firing party take aim, Morant shouts out, "Shoot straight, you bastards!" A cracking line, but I'm afraid not from any contemporary sources. But hey, why ruin a good story? I bet Harry Morant, bush poet and raconteur, certainly wouldn't have. Harry Breaker Morant did, by his own admission, order the murder of unarmed Boer prisoners. But was he following a chain of verbal orders? Or was he bent on avenging his friend, Captain Hunt? Was he punished in a way others weren't? Or was justice done for his Boer victims? I guess we will never truly know, but I bet you now have an opinion. If you love learning about the people and events that made Britain such an incredible country, not just the battles, but the wider events through the centuries, then you might enjoy my free weekly newsletter. This week, for instance, I was looking at exactly who won the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Start getting your copy by clicking on the link in the description. And let's keep sharing great stories from British history.